Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine, messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you're too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Otep, this is Femi here with Freedom Now, and your ears are in tuned at high frequencies in a liberated zone. Freedom Now is a Pan-Africanist, global news outlet from coast to coast, dispelling the Western propaganda media and their all lies point of views. Freedom Now is devoted to relay true news, views, and proper clues to form solutions around freedom for the oppressed worldwide. Now, get relaxed, grab a pen, and phone a friend, because Freedom Now is set to begin to awaken deep sleepers dreaming about freedom now, within, in, freedom now, in.
Habari Gani. This is Sister Thage with Freedom Now's agenda for the week of December 16, 2023. As we are in Fund Drive, we continue to bring you a full hour of radical programming. We commence with our ancestor, Didan Kamati, in the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar. In this hour, prolific author, radical historian, professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne interviews Marv Truhe, who was a JAG lawyer. JAG is a Judge Advocate General's Corps in the Army, who defended several of the Vietnam War sailors and relates what really happened in his first-person account. He's here to discuss his book, Against All Tides, The Untold Story of the USS Kitty Hawk Race Riot. Then, later in the hour, Dr. Horne interviews Kathryn Benjamin Golden, Assistant Professor of Africana Studies at the University of Delaware, here to discuss her article in the Journal of African American History, which was also from her dissertation work at Berkeley. The article is titled, Armed in the Great Swamp, Fear, Maroon Insurrection, and the Insurgent Ecology of the Great Dismal Swamp. Our music clip mix includes MLK, Zap Mama, MIA, Cannonball Adderley, John Schofield, Eddie Harris, Joe Henderson, Miles Davis, and more. Also, we want to remind our listeners to mark your calendars for 2024, Saturday, February 3rd. Dr. Horne will be here in Los Angeles as Freedom Now and Move the Crowd program have an event with Dr. Gerald Horne. He'll be discussing his books, I Dare Say, and Acknowledging Radical Histories. This event is hosted by Dr. Melina Abdullah, and they will be in conversation. There will be a book signing. The event is taking place in Africatown Leimert Park, Saturday, February 3rd, 2024, from 1 to 3 p.m., 3423 West 43rd Place, 90008. So sit back, phone in to support this hour, and as always, we stand ready for revolution.
Alafia, this is the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar for the week of December 12th. We present this calendar as an aspect of our ideological arsenal, realizing that history is a weapon for liberation of the oppressed, or can be used by the oppressor to maintain our oppression. depending on the class, gender, and nationality of the definers of history. December 13, 1971. 6,000 workers go on strike, paralyzing the settler colony of Namibia, led by SWAPO, the Southwest African People's Organization. December 13, 1903, Ella Baker was born. She was the founder of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Field Soldiers for the Civil Rights Movement. She also founded the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, the mothership of the Black Panther Party, as well as being a leading activist in the Puerto Rican Solidarity Committee. Her theory that a strong people don't need strong leaders was the hallmark of the collectivist grassroots approach to mass organizing. She was an organizer, philosopher, teacher, and great orator. She wrote the book, More Than Just a Hamburger, a critique of the charismatic leadership in the civil rights movement. December 14, 1960, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Declaration on the Granting of Independence to colonial countries and peoples of the world. December 14, 1928, Trinidad Tescon crosses over. In 1895, she joined the soldiers of the Andres Bonifacio Brigade, the Katipunan nationalist labor movement in the armed struggle against Spanish colonialism, as well as she founded the Red Cross in the Philippines. December 15, 1890, Sitting Bull, Sioux resistance leader assassinated by United States government-controlled Indian police force. December 16, 1961, the African National Congress, the major liberation movement in South Africa, institutes Umkhonto we Sizwe, its guerrilla wing heralding the armed phase of the struggle for liberation from settler colonialism in South Africa. December 16, 1511, Berselit, a Malaysian sister, was born. She developed a national art of self-defense called Silat, which today has many forms and many schools. As a peasant, she went to a stream for water. There she watched a tiger fight a large bird for several hours. Her husband attempted to hit her for being away so long. She evaded and counterattacked using the methods of the two animals she had been watching. She went on to teach other women of her region this form of self-defense. Malaysia subsequently became famous for its women martial artists. December 17, 1961, Zimbabwe's African People's Union was founded. ZAPU was one of the two national liberation movements which led Zimbabwe to liberation from European settler colonial rule. Its founder and president, Dr. Robert Mugabe, is in the vanguard of the nationalization of land from large European farmers back into the control of the African masses. December 18, 1946, Steve Biko, the leader of the Black Consciousness Movement, was born. Brother Biko founded the Black Power movement of South Africa with the inclusion of national liberation and the regaining of the land of Africa for Africans as an advancement beyond Black Power. December 19, 1946, France invades Vietnam to stop Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh guerrillas from establishing an independent government of Vietnam run by and for the Vietnamese people. This has been the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar. You can hear this broadcast in the archives at kpfk.org under Archives. You can gain contact information on the guests, music listing, and agenda at kpfk.org under Programs, or you can contact us at freedomnow@kpfk.org. We will close out with our chant of a mandala, which power to the people. You can respond away to. A mandala, away to. A mandala, away to. Mandala, away to.
Pledge $100 to receive a signed copy of the new book, hot off the presses. I dare say, a Gerald Horne reader. Return to those thrilling days of yesterday and yesteryear and read a scintillating analysis of the Watts Revolt of 1965 and the LA Rebellion of 1992. Read about the massive global anti-apartheid movement that delivered South African independence by 1994 one of our most significant victories of all time. Read of the exploits of the most underrated and underpublicized of our Black women activist intellectuals, speaking of Shirley Graham Du Bois. Read an analysis of why the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s was a devastating defeat for Africans and African Americans from which we have yet to recover. Read about why the escapade in Ukraine by US imperialism will probably accelerate the rise of China to global preeminence and accelerate the ongoing crisis of white supremacy. Read an analysis of the close relationship between Black Americans and Japan that led directly to the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, a direct outgrowth of this tie. Read an analysis of the concept of the lumpen, popularized by the Black Panther Party, which was then bequeathed to Compton's iteration of, quote, gangster rap, unquote, and the morphing of the very term gangster into everything from a noun to a verb. And read of why left-wing white nationalism is one of the more persistent ideological problems the broader left and the Black liberation movement have yet to confront. But wait, there's more! Pledge $100 and receive a signed copy of yet another book, hot off the presses, Acknowledging Radical Histories, Conversations with Gerald Horne. Read analyses of settler colonialism, the pernicious system which continues to oppress us. Read of the history of the music we call jazz and how it has provided a clarion call for inspiration and revolt. Read of the lives of past giants like Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois. But wait, there's still more! Pledge $180 and receive 2 signed copies of 2 new books, I Dare Say and Acknowledging Radical Histories. Pick up the phone and call
818-985-KPFK, 818-985-5735, or pledge online at kpfk.org.
For KPFK Los Angeles Pacifica Radio, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is attorney Marv Truhe, author of the book Against All Tides, The Untold Story of the USS Kitty Hawk Race Riot. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, attorney Truhe.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I've been looking forward to this.
And we have been looking forward to interview you. So why did you write this book? And by the way, what happened on the USS Kitty Hawk in the early 1970s?
I wrote the book to set the story straight because to date, there has not been a complete telling, an unbiased telling of what happened. The incident happened on the evening of October 11th, 1972, off the coast of North Vietnam, when the USS Kitty Hawk, an attack carrier, was conducting daily bombing runs into North Vietnam. And that evening, shortly after air operations, violent racial confrontations broke out on board the ship that lasted for several hours. And my book is a story about the incident, giving details that have not been reported before, as well as the trials afterwards. And I'm writing from a first-person account with regard to the trials because I was a Navy JAG defense lawyer stationed in San Diego at the time, and I represented young Black sailors who were charged with rioting and assaults arising out of that incident.
Now, speaking of young Black sailors, one of them was Hiram Davis, a young Black man at the time who had roots in Los Angeles. Is there anything you could tell us about him?
Well, I didn't represent Hiram, but I do talk about his case. He grew up in Los Angeles, and he was one of the 25 defendants, 25 Black sailors who were charged following the incident. And one of the reasons I wrote the book is because even though they were interracial confrontations that lasted for several hours, there were 25 black sailors and not a single white sailor charged. And Hiram Davis happened to be one of those. And his lawyer was, in addition to JAG defense lawyers, which every one of the defendants had, the NAACP stepped forward and they retained half a dozen California attorneys, civilian attorneys. And in this particular case, his attorney, who worked alongside JAG counsel, not myself, was Alex Landon. And one of the things I mentioned in the book is Hiram said that he told his lawyer that he saw more prejudice and more discrimination while he was in the Navy than he ever saw growing up in Los Angeles.
Now, you mentioned Alex Landon, who I presume is still in the land of the living and still practicing law in San Diego. Is that accurate?
That is correct. I was very fortunate in writing the book. I knew I was going to write the book following the trials when I was actually serving as a military judge. And so I retained several thousand pages of original source documents, which I carried around me for these decades until I finally finished the book. But I also had the benefit of talking to 13 of the Kitty Hawk lawyers, including some prosecutors, but that included 5 of the NAACP retained attorneys, and Alex Landon is one of those. And as you mentioned, yes, he is still practicing law. And we were very fortunate in having the resources of the NAACP in these trials for a reason I can mention later, in addition to the help from the civilian lawyers. And Alex Landon is a very unique individual in the sense that his family came from Germany, and his father and his grandfather were both sent to Buchenwald concentration camp, and his grandparents actually perished during the Holocaust, but his father emigrated to the United States and actually was active in the United States Army during the Second World War.
You also mentioned in passing on page 317 that you were an attorney for sailors involved in a sit-down strike off the coast of North Vietnam. I presume that this is during the same time, the early 1970s, as the Kitty Hawk affair. But could you describe that and tell us how common was such a job action?
Well, the actual sit-down strike happened in port in San Diego aboard the USS Constellation, a sister ship to the USS Kitty Hawk. And 3 weeks after the Kitty Hawk incident, which was off the coast of North Vietnam, in port, 120 black sailors refused to return to the ship. They had a sit-down strike right there on the pier because of many of the discriminations and injustices that they shared with the Kitty Hawk sailors. That had to do with unjust punishments, discrimination in captain's mess, and punishments for non-judicial punishments on board, discrimination with regard to promotions, discrimination with regard to job assignments. As for how common it was, well, of course, during the early 70s and the late 60s, there was a lot of civil unrest going on throughout the country. But these cases were unique in that they were taking place on board or as part of ship complements, and very unique circumstances. For example, following this incident, the captain of the ship conducted totally one-sided investigations. He absolutely directed the investigators on board the Kitty Hawk not to interview or take statements from any black sailors. And as a result, as I mentioned, he ended up bringing charges, courts-martial charges, against 25 black sailors and not a single white sailor. And the injustices continued. All of those, with one or two exceptions, were in pretrial confinement awaiting their trials. And that meant several months in Navy brigs, both in Subic Bay and also in the naval station in San Diego, several months awaiting their individual trials, including in solitary confinement. And I talk about the ramifications of that pretrial confinement. Keep in mind, before trial, presumed innocent, including one of my clients who attempted suicide while he was in solitary confinement. Totally unjust circumstance. And then it continued into the trials. And as we have alluded to, in that one case, Cleveland Mallory, one of my clients, he was convicted with perjured testimony by a white sailor, blatant perjury. And it was obvious to everybody in the courtroom, except apparently the judge, who convicted him anyway. Now, fortunately, as I mentioned, we had the resources of the NAACP, and those of us in the defense team were able to retain an undercover agent, a former FBI agent, a former Marine officer. He was actually a law student in San Diego at the time, who went undercover, and he befriended the perjurer, the white sailor, and got him to admit on taped conversation, secretly recorded, that he had made up the entire story and that he was out to get as many black sailors as he could in other cases. And when those tapes became public record, because the NAACP had a press conference in New York City, the cases all of a sudden started turning in our favor. And some of the white sailors started recanting their testimony, indicating they were no longer going to testify because they were concerned in many cases that they might have also been taped. And as a result of that, might have perjury charges. And in fact, that white sailor was convicted of perjury several months after the incident.
So did that perjurer do hard time?
Repeat that?
Did that perjurer, did he serve a prison term, and for how long?
Well, that's another one of the injustices with regard to the case, because he had a pretrial agreement, totally unjustified, by the convening authority of that court. And even though we went to trial and he had pled guilty and was sentenced by a jury panel of officers and enlisted to a bad conduct discharge and confinement, a pretrial agreement that nobody was aware of said that he would get off scot-free, and that's exactly what happened. So one of the most egregious injustices of perjured testimony leading to the conviction of one of my clients, which was later reversed because of the tapes, ended up with no punishment for the perjurer.
You mentioned early in the book that there were cases, or at least a case, of paying Filipinos in the Philippines Islands to attack black sailors. Was that common, or was that unique?
I think that was probably unique, but in the months leading up to the incident, the new captain on board the ship, Captain Townsend, had a very discriminatory way of treating assaults that took place among his sailors. If there was a black assailant, he meted out maximum punishments. If it was a white assailant, no punishment at all, dismissed charges. In only one incident did he ever bring any punishment against a blatant assault by a white sailor against a black, and that was a $25 fine. And the incident you're talking about, I believe, was isolated, but one of his white sailors, one of the crew members, was in fact paying nationals, Filipino nationals, in the Philippine Islands. Longopo City was Liberty Town right next to the Subic Bay Naval Base, paying them to assault black sailors. And even though those black sailors, 5 of them came forward and positively identified the white sailor, the captain chose not to bring any charges. And that tension that was building up for the months leading up to this incident was because of those impartial, those not, to just say discriminatory actions in terms of his captain's masts.
Now, you've already made reference to the fact that a chief witness perjured himself. You've suggested that the judge was not wholly impartial. And I'm wondering, could you describe what you mean by that? And also, once again, how common was that in terms of your own experience as a defense counsel within the Navy system?
Well, one of the things that I mentioned in the book is something that was brought to my attention by one of the NAACP lawyers, actually from San Francisco, is helping us on the cases. And one of the things that he talked about was how people can hold biases and prejudices in our society without any inkling that they are prejudiced. And that directly relates to the judge who insisted, actually the day before my trial, he was quoted in the San Diego Union Tribune saying that as far as he knew, he had no racial prejudices at all. He happened to come from a small town in Georgia. And yet during that trial, even though we established conclusively that perjury was going on by that white sailor, we established that through the testimony of the department head of Cleveland Mallory's, he still convicted Cleveland Mallory and gave him a bad conduct discharge. And so that's one of the things I touch on in the book, is how people are of all ethnicities, all beliefs, and all persuasions, who would never consider for a minute that they harbored any racial or other prejudices, are a product of their environments, their upbringing, and life experiences. And the military judge in that case is a case in point. I knew him very well. I had tried cases for 2 years before that. I spent a year on the bench afterward. We were the only 2 military judges in the law center for my last year. So I knew him very well. He was a career Navy officer. But I talk about that in the book, and the ramifications of that were obviously a lot of injustices in not only the investigation, but in the confinement of the sailors before trial and also the outcomes of the trials. But fortunately, again, we were able to see justice done in virtually all of the cases. And one of the real positive outcomes of the case is not a single one of those black sailors received a bad conduct discharge. And without exception, even those that led to convictions, there were convictions of things like simple assault or disturbing the peace, and they received very light sentences. So even though the book is a story about racial injustices, the outcomes were ultimately very positive.
On page 162, you discuss protests in San Diego under the slogan, "Free the Kitty Hawk 21." And of course, repeatedly, you've talked about the role of the NAACP. Anything else to add about protests that might have contributed to a more or less positive outcome?
Well, in addition to protesting the actual charging of those young black sailors, it was obvious to everybody, anybody that knew even the simple details about 25 black sailors and not a single white sailor being charged on interracial confrontations that lasted for several hours. In San Diego at the time, there were a lot of anti-war protests going on. Keeping in mind, for those of your listeners who are old enough, during the Vietnam War, there was a lot of split in the country itself, especially as the war went on for years, about whether we should even be in Vietnam and putting our young Americans at risk. And so those protests included not only anti-war protests, but in this case, protests with regard to the obvious injustice of what was going on and what was happening in the courtroom. And part of that was exacerbated by the fact that another of the injustices, I could give you a litany, was that the government chose to withhold evidence from those of us in the defense team. And that was a blatant violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And we fought for 2 months to get the investigative reports. We didn't even get statements that our clients had made that the government had taken after they had charged them. Typewritten statements. We took 2 months and went all the way to the federal court in San Diego to get documents that the Uniform Code of Military Justice obligates them to give to us. And that also led to some unjust convictions. which fortunately we were later able to overturn. So that was the atmosphere. That was what was happening in San Diego, and of course, it's microcosm what was happening in the entire country at the time.
I take it that you were on the verge of court-martial yourself because of your vigorous advocacy. Is that a fair assumption?
That is. As a matter of fact, before the trials even started, the convening authority, who happened to be the commanding officer of the Naval Air Station San Diego, said that he was going to remove me as defense counsel because he said that I had violated some obscure Navy regulation in that I had helped an NAACP lawyer fly out to the Kitty Hawk when it was still 2 days off the coast, returning from Westpac. And he said that that was a violation of having a civilian go board a warship at that point. And if that outcome of that told me he was going to remove me as defense counsel, which he had the power to do. But I fought back, and we filed an action to have him removed as the convening authority. Now, you can imagine the uproar that caused. A very junior officer, myself, as a lieutenant, bringing charges against the commanding officer of Naval Air Station, not as charges as such, but a motion to have him removed. Well, I was not successful in getting him removed. He was not successful in getting me removed as a defense counsel. But then there was a very thinly veiled threat of having me court-martialed as a result of how vigorous I was in the defense of those young men. But that also did not happen.
Court-martial would have meant you're serving hard time, I take it.
Well, not necessarily that, but certainly would have been a real smear on my record, both military and later on as a practicing attorney. But fortunately, that didn't happen mostly because by the time the trials got into about the third month, the national press, local press, everybody was picking up on all of the injustices. And those stories were starting to come out. And of course, they were triggered by the perjury tapes. That was sort of the point at which the tide began turning in favor of our clients. And of course, the title of the book, Against All Tides, is used because we definitely on the defense team felt that we were fighting against all tides, against the military brass. One of the questions I always get in my talks, and I've given numerous talks to veterans groups, is if the Navy pushed back on the publication of my book. And I'm happy to say quite the contrary. They have been promoting my book. As a matter of fact, I spent 3 days at the U.S. Naval Academy this spring talking about my book, and I've given numerous talks here in Colorado to veterans groups. And so it's been a very positive response from the Navy because they recognize that my book is not an indictment of the Navy. It's an indictment of certain officers in the Navy.
Finally, attorney Marv Truhe, author of the book Against All Tides, The Untold Story of the USS Kitty Hawk Race Riot. How can our audience reach you? I take it that you have a website. What is your URL?
Yes, I have a website, marvtruhe.com, marvtruhe.com, and that is a web page on my book, and it has a lot of photographs, historical photographs of the young sailors of various things in Westpac and San Diego, Law Center and the Brig and that sort of thing. And it has excerpts from the book. And for those that are interested in possibly reading the book, I would suggest they go to the marvtruhe.com website. And the book can be obtained. It's published in hardcover, but it's going to come out in paperback in October. It was published last October. And that book can be reached at Barnes & Noble, on Goodreads, on Amazon Books. And again, if you look at the book webpage, it'll give you a better idea of the book, the scope of the book, and the issues that I covered and wanted to bring to light. It's unusual for a military history book to have the amount of citations I have. Military history, of course, always has citations, but I have over 1,000 endnote citations because it was very important to me that this book have credibility that it be fair and balanced, that it have integrity. I did not want it to be a one-sided rant by a disgruntled defense lawyer. I wanted it to be fair and cover all aspects of what happened.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Attorney Marv Truhe. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Pacifica Radio, Los Angeles.
And thank you.
Pledge $100 to receive a signed copy of the new book, hot off the presses, I Dare Say, a Gerald Horne reader. Return to those thrilling days of yesterday and yesteryear and read a scintillating analysis of the Watts Revolt of 1965 and the LA Rebellion of 1992. Read about the massive global anti-apartheid movement that delivered South African independence by 1994, one of our most significant victories of all time. Read of the exploits of the most underrated and underpublicized of our Black women activist intellectuals, speaking of Shirley Graham Du Bois. Read an analysis of why the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s was a devastating defeat for Africans and African Americans from which we have yet to recover. Read about why the escapade in Ukraine by U.S. imperialism will probably accelerate the rise of China to global preeminence and accelerate the ongoing crisis of white supremacy. Read an analysis of the close relationship between Black Americans and Japan that led directly to the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. A direct outgrowth of this tie. Read an analysis of the concept of the lumpen, popularized by the Black Panther Party, which was then bequeathed to Compton's iteration of, quote, gangster rap, unquote, and the morphing of the very term gangster into everything from a noun to a verb. And read of why left-wing white nationalism is one of the more persistent ideological problems the broader left and the Black liberation movement have yet to confront. But wait, there's more. Pledge $100 and receive a signed copy of yet another book, hot off the presses, Acknowledging Radical Histories, Conversations with Gerald Horne. Read analyses of settler colonialism, the pernicious system which continues to oppress us. Read of the history of the music we call jazz, and how it has provided a clarion call for inspiration and revolt. Read of the lives of past giants like Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois. But wait, there's still more. Pledge $180 and receive 2 signed copies of 2 new books, I Dare Say and Acknowledging Radical Histories. Pick up the phone and call
818-985 KPFK 818-985-5735 or pledge online at kpfk.org.
We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
For Pacifica Radio, KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Katherine Benjamin Golden, Assistant Professor of Africana Studies at the University of Delaware, and author of an article in the Journal of African American History entitled Armed in the Great Swamp, Fear, Maroon Insurrection, and the Insurgent Ecology of the Great Dismal Swamp, an offshoot of her Berkeley dissertation. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Golden.
Hello.
Thank you so much for having me. I so appreciate this opportunity to speak with you.
Ditto. So
Yes.
why did you choose to study this topic?
Well, I am, I think, fundamentally led by the question, how are we still here? How do we persevere? How is it that we have survived one of the greatest human atrocities in planetary history? And what lessons do ancestors give as we still navigate the afterlives of slavery, or the afterlife of slavery? So that's my fundamental question that drives me in the work I do. But I came across the Great Dismal Swamp with that spirit, right, with that motivation, and a lifelong training in from my family upbringing. So personally, very personally, but then also in terms of the work I've done at various institutions, always in Black studies, Africana studies, African diaspora studies. But I came across in an edited volume, edited by the anthropologist Richard Price, called Maroon Societies in the America. And in this volume, there are dozens of records and dozens of pieces in there and chapters in there in varied sections of the book, which is geographically organized. So you have a section on the Spanish Americas, you have a section on the French Caribbean, you have a section on the Dutch territories, and then you have this section on North America. And there's one chapter, and it is penned by the great Herbert Aptheker, who's, I think it's his 1939 article is republished there in Richard Price's anthology. And in that chapter, which looks at United States Maroon communities that existed in the United States South, ranging from Louisiana to Florida to Alabama to Mississippi and the Carolinas, North Carolina and Virginia. And there's one little tidbit, one little line that he is talking about the Great Dismal Swamp. And the only information that he yields in that early 20th century moment when he's authoring this is that there was some 2,000 Maroons that lived in this swamp. Now, my colleagues and I that do work on this swamp, it's a mystery to us still how he came up with this very concrete and decided upon number of 2,000 people who were living here across time until the Civil War, or rather the end of the Civil War. It piqued my interest to learn and dig and find out more about who were these 2,000 people and what was their life like? What were their life ways? How did they sustain Marronage? I just wanted to learn more. And so I began to do so. And at the time, there were, hardly anything at the time had been published on the Great Dismal Swamp. Now there's several book-length studies on this history and this place. But that is how I entered into studying this swamp, which is on the outskirts, which is on the straddling sort of the eastern seaboard between North Carolina and Virginia. So that's how I entered into studying this. I began, of course, with finding and searching whatever was digitized about this swamp, from runaway slave ads where people are frantically trying to reclaim their human property and adding that they believe so-and-so has run into the Great Dismal Swamp. So from records like that to records about very alarmed records of planters and enslavers locally in the cities and towns surrounding the swamp, frantically exchanging and publishing these letters that they're writing at the brink of a conspiracy to rebel, that they believed that people were organizing this rebellion in this swamp, or that they believed people's destination would be in this swamp. So thinking about this swamp as kind of a magnet for this kind of overt resistance that you see happen in this area. And that's the direction that my dissertation took in some aspects, but my dissertation was looking at this swamp across time, and the work that I'm now doing is more so about the actual history. But so yes, so that is how I entered into this, and I went there. I trekked the swamp, and I could tell you about what that lent to my development, to how I've approached this topic now as well. Being there was really key, I think, to how I think about this swamp as a sort of living archive, a living space.
So a Maroon community is fundamentally a community of the enslaved that have escaped the jurisdiction of the enslavers.
Yes.
And you questioned the figure of 2,000 Africans being in the Great Dismal Swamp.
Right.
What is the consensus today about the numbers?
So it is now, I think, amongst the sort of the leading scholars of this swamp space. So Dan Sayers, who led the archaeological dig there, and has written about his findings. Marcus Navius has also published City of Refuge, Slavery, and Petite Marronage in the Great Dismal Swamp. And he's really looking at Petite Marronage, so just sort of small scale marooning that was operating and happening along the canals as they were being dug really by enslaved labor. So that's a particular angle of the study of this swamp with that. And then Brent Morris as well, who has written Dismal Freedom more recently last year. And all of these, and myself, and all of these authors and scholars are safely, we can assume, thousands, if not tens of thousands of people from the period really where the slave trade is really ramping up toward the latter half of the 17th century to 1865. You have thousands, if not tens of thousands, and it's difficult to be certain, but certainly some people in flight, some self-emancipating people are there temporarily, but they count as well. Some people stay for a smaller number of days or weeks. They also count because they are in fact using this swamp space to create an alternative to enslavement and doing so by way of this wilderness space. So that is considered 10. I would say over 10,000 people across those across this period. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So talk to us about insurrectionary activity in the Great Dismal Swamp. And also, since they were surrounded by hostile forces, how did they obtain arms?
Well, that's a really good question. So there were several plots surrounding this swamp that involve the actual space and the use of this space for these political means. And people are using this to devise organized plans to have and execute organized revolts and resistance. And I was, in some of those books that I mentioned to you that exist now around the history of the swamp, that it has been less of the focus, but yet it really is glaring to me as I look at some of the same records that this swamp was, again, a kind of locus of insurgency that was really emboldening. And so that was the way that, I chose to really think about that and sit with that and collect all of these somewhat fear-driven, but also really real and undeniable accounts of so-called runaways hiding guns, hiding swords, many different kinds of weapons actually come out of some of the records I've scanned and really scoured. And even I think there was a bow and arrow at one point that was mentioned in one record. Someone making their own sort of armor. In fact, so Maroons require. This is about self-defense. This is about a kind of reciprocal force. When at the onset of colonization and slavery and slave trade, it's war. And I think Maroons really understand this kind of ongoing warfare that that slavery in fact is and was. And so this is a response. And so Maroons are not just apathetic, just, sort of living in terms of self-removal and not caring about what's going on outside of their wilderness spaces. And I have really seen that in the history of this Dismal Swamp. Of course, this Dismal Swamp is just one of many, many Maroon communities and Maroon societies across the Americas. But how are they procuring the weapons? Through clever tactics such as pillaging, raiding, as well as trade networks and subversive networks that existed between the enslaved and them, and also sometimes between poor white men and Maroon groups. And you even see that in the history of the Dismal Swamp, but of course that you see that pretty much across the Americas as well. And so it's those kind of networks, but also, again, there is a real forceful lifestyle that these Maroons sometimes took up in terms of raiding and looting and stealing from nearby farms and stores, etc.
So how did the Maroons in the Great Dismal Swamp relate to the indigenous communities?
Yeah, and the answer is really that these relationships between indigenous peoples and self-emancipating African descendants or Maroons sometimes is fraught. Sometimes it is fraught, and it's we're talking about in the history of the United States at some point, colonial slavery, but later, of course, really settler, antebellum slavery. But certainly in the earlier moments, there's evidence in the history of the Great Dismal Swamp where you see in the executive papers that come out of that this earlier period. And I'm really thinking about 1709, 1710. And there's an example I would give where Scipio is listed as one insurgent in a plan to basically take over and take down Williamsburg and overthrow slavery in this moment. But this conspiracy involved Maroons and the use of the Great Dismal Swamp. But he was listed and specified as a, quote, Indian. So he was someone who was working with Maroons who were also noted to be of Angola Peter, and so that means they were African born very early on in this early colony. So there are some collaborative moments like that where people understand that they have a shared and a mutual interest in working together or in collaboration against the colony, against slavery itself, at the Indians, at their native people at this time. Indigenous people are also being thrust into a kind of bondage and slavery at this same time. Later, you see the use of native people such as the Catawba in South Carolina, for example, against Maroons there, who are actually incentivized, paid, and paid. And some of the incentives are, we'll recognize your land rights at, the British colonists are making these deals with native people sometimes against Maroons who are hard to get, hard to capture without the aid of people who know the land so very well. So it is fraught. It has been fraught. For the most part, in the longer expanse of the history of the Great Dismal Swamp, the people who are marooning are African descendant people. Although at first there is some evidence that native people are also using the swamp for a kind of safety and refuge against this emergency, which is slavery and colonization.
So are there still Black people residing in that region of the Great Dismal Swamp?
Oh, yes. There are many Black people residing with the swamp literally in their backyards. And so part of what my dissertation was doing was to understand those land relationships as they've evolved across time. As this swamp, this space is, it's a really profound space to be in. But I was interested in questions around memory and what they knew, how they thought about this space, and whether or not there were associations to the the actual landscape or swampscape rather, and human history and the history of their own ancestors. And I was looking for accounts of people who marooned that were in people's ancestry and families. And I found a few, accounts of that. But if you're asking, are there living Maroons in Virginia who are calling themselves Maroons, as the Windward Maroons in Jamaica today call themselves and maintain their ancestral lands, and same as in Suriname and other places in the Caribbean and Latin America, but that we don't see in Virginia. There's not a sovereignty or group of people who identify as Maroons and remain in the lands that they began to live in as they were self-possessing and self-emancipating during the period of slavery. That we have not seen in the context of Virginia and North Carolina.
Finally, Professor Golden, Assistant Professor of Africana Studies at the University of Delaware, do you have further plans for publication on this topic, and what does your future research concern?
Yeah, I do. So I am working steadfastly on the publication of my book manuscript, This Insurgent Ground, Black Women, Maroonage, and Rebellion in the Great Dismal Swamp. So I am now really offering a new focus, which is unprecedented in the history of the Dismal Swamp, but also it is something that is too slow for me in terms of growing and development in the larger field of slavery and United States history, where the history of slavery revolts and overt resistance, where we have a slow crawl to thinking about Black women's instrumental contributions to really bold forms of resistance that are not exclusively thinking about sort of day-to-day or everyday forms of covert resistance, but how do Black women figure into an actual revolt, or how do Black women figure into Maroonage, which is, willful living against the grain, right? So, or as fugitives, more broadly. And so those questions are really taken up. Why is it that there is a kind of masculinization of Maroons, whereas we really know there are key women figures in the history of Maroonage as a hemispheric phenomenon, say, thinking about Queen Nanny in Jamaica, Solitude of Guadeloupe, et cetera. And there are many of these examples. So what about some of those named and unnamed women that are living and nurturing Maroon communities and giving birth in the swamps of Virginia and North Carolina? So those are the questions that this project takes up. And I am hoping that we will get that published in the next year or two.
Well, we all look forward to that day. You will have a number of readers, including myself, Professor Golden, Assistant Professor of Africana Studies at the University of Delaware, author of the article in the Journal of African American History, Armed in the Great Swamp, Fear, Maroon Insurrection, and the Insurgent Ecology of the Great Dismal Swamp. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much.
And in closing, we'd like to thank all those who donated this hour to support Freedom Now and help keep the lights on in the building here at KPFK. We'd like to thank our guest, Marv Truhe. Thank you, Professor Kathryn Benjamin Golden. Thank you to our producers, Dr. Gerald Horne, Sister Flora, Sister Femi, Brother Brandon, our board op Wendell, and all those who made today's program possible. This program, as well as prior programs, can be reheard for the next 60 days. Go to kpfk.org, audio archives, scroll to Freedom Now. Signing off for Freedom Now, this is Sister Thage, and until next week, as always, we stand ready for revolution.